So as I said, I'm Andrew Wichmann. I work for Johns Hopkins University in their tech transfer office, which is called Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures. This has been a really interesting experience for me. There's a lot of discussion of sort of at the geopolitical level of how open source is facilitating collaboration, how it's like engendering technical development and economic impact. I think of our offices and offices like ours as sort of in the middle of all that. So in some sense, we are a mechanism of delivering nation-state level policy about technical development. In another sense, we are doing deals. We are starting companies. We're doing very granular things that are much closer to the sort of nuts and bolts of economies than national policy, for example. So I think it's just kind of interesting to see different aspects of what open source means to different types of communities. I was told this worked. Great, okay. So, our title is Standardizing Open Source Impact Metrics. Metrics are a part of it. I think it's more to think about, first, how do we sort of justify participation in offices like ours in open source? So, like, what are the policy motivations? What is, like, the theoretical motivations of our office? And then the metrics go to, how do we count what we're doing, and how do we measure the impact of our actions? A lot of this goes to stuff that was said earlier about the visibility of people contributing to open source. So a lot of the people I'll talk about here are like me. It's not a formal part of our job to be dealing with open source projects. We're trying to change that and try to create a structure for understanding how that type of activity fits in with tech transfer offices. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just explaining to you what tech transfer offices are for those who aren't familiar, because I think it's important to understand that in contrast to what I'm trying to advocate for. Okay. Yeah, I noticed that. All right. So that's me on the right. By training, I'm a lawyer. I was a patent lawyer. I did a lot of work in intellectual property. Did basically work getting companies started from the private sector, and now I do that from the inside of the university for technology that comes out of universities. My colleague Ashwati works at University of Michigan, does basically the same thing. And then my other colleague here, Megan Forbes, we are the primary contributors to this talk, and we have a real early draft paper up on the Zenodo. But Megan works with me. We are fortunate enough at Johns Hopkins University to have an open source programs office. That is not a common thing in academia. There's Stephanie's here. She's one of the other lucky ones. She runs UC Santa Cruz's office. There's roughly a dozen of them in the US. There's more scattered around the world. There's plenty. In Germany, I know there's some. Japan has one. Dublin has one. Or Trinity College Dublin has one. But they're not a common thing. So what's nice is that we have extra resources to try to do this kind of thing. And so that's been a real pleasure. A lot of other people have contributed to this. So this is really just a manifestation of meetings we've been having for the last 2+ years with different tech transfer offices across the country. There's roughly 50 of them. These are just some of the individuals. Lots of other folks have contributed thoughts. Everyone sort of in this position of, we think we should be supporting this type of activity on campuses, but there's no real justification for us to do so. So what do we think that would look like? Let me check on time real quick, because I don't want to take too long. Okay. So a real quick background on what technology transfer offices do. This is US-centric because that's what I know, but Brazil has a similar law. I looked it up when I came over here. Most other countries, Germany, Japan, China, all have similar types of tech transfer laws, which were created for us. It's a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. It was from 1980, I believe, was its institution. And what that did is, before that time, federal funding it was a mixed bag. You never really knew where the intellectual property lied from a federal funding arrangement. And federal funding in the US, that is where all basic research gets funded. So the idea was, why don't we centralize where ownership over the IP and that type of research is held, and that will help to more efficiently transfer it out into the world to provide benefit. After the Bayh-Dole Act was passed, that law basically boils down to universities receiving federal funding in the United States own the patent rights in the inventions that come out of that research. I'm going to talk a lot about patents for a minute here, even though it's not really germane to open source, because it, again, illustrates sort of the contrast. So these offices were all set up to translate research via patent licenses to the greater economy in the United States. There's no discussion or impact, at least on the original Bayh-Dole Act, around copyright or software or thinking of other types of transmissions. Even though if you look at a lot of these statutes, they speak very broadly about what they are trying to do. They are trying to translate economic impact in general, and they don't really care what kind of mechanism you use to do it. But in practice, it is a patent statute. It is, as I said earlier, the way that federal funding gets translated to the economy. So it is, the primary mechanism when you have a new initiative that some agency wants to execute, they award grants, universities get them, universities patent that stuff, and they license it. And that's like why our offices exist fundamentally. It's been, there's a lot of correlation between growth in the biotech industry and this statute. So that is like when you see tech transfer held up, at least in the United States, like biotech is like what is held up as being the validator of it, because it has corresponded with that, with the growth of that industry. It is not so much for the rest of the economy. And I keep going backwards. So here's a quick outline of just like what the offices do. As I said, we get money in, someone invents something. Fundamentally, we patent those things, and then we look to license it out to some other company. And that takes three general forms. There's either an industry player, like an existing company, or it's part of some sort of co-development process with an existing company, or it's a startup that usually is affiliated with the inventor or the person that came up with it, who wants to start their own business. And then, money comes back from that and gets redistributed. Most universities work the same. Like an inventor will get a share, the inventor's department, their school will get a share, and the idea is you create this virtuous cycle of you commercialize research, that money comes back to the university and gets reinvested in the type of research that had proven beneficial. So that's the general process. Okay. Another quick thing. So there's this organization in the US called the Association of University Technology Managers. It is the standard sort of trade body of tech transfer. And these are the type of things they measure. And again, I illustrate this to show, there's no discussion of open source on that screen. It's a lot of patents. It's a lot of counting how many patents you filed, how many inventions have been disclosed. If the offices are profitable, they'll throw up there how much licensing revenue they've made that year, how many companies they've started, et cetera. So one way to think about this is, we're trying to come up with similar types of metrics to show productivity in open source translation at universities and what our offices can do to engender that sort of thing. So here's like a basic summary of what, rationales for why tech transfer offices should be doing this. I mentioned earlier, if you have an open source programs office on your campus, that's a natural place for a lot of this to happen. Unfortunately, that's like a rare. So, most universities are left, as I say, lack of alternatives. We're the only shop in town that works to do this type of work. I pasted it in blue there. That's our mission statement. That's from my offices. Most offices look the same. Just to reiterate that, our mission is to translate technology to benefit society. There's no specification on what mechanism. And I think it probably is obvious to everyone in this room that open source has been the most effective mechanism for a lot of computational research. I mean, that is, other forms of transfer are possible, but open source has had a dramatic impact on translating basic research into computational tools that we all use. So some other reasons why you think of TTOs as the place that this should happen. We have people who work all day licensing intellectual property. We have folks that have some expertise in what IP is. There's really no one else on university campuses that have that. And so, if you're thinking about how licenses work and making sustainable open source projects, having someone with that sort of expertise is really beneficial. We also are generally the organizations that are legally authorized by universities to do this sort of thing. So, signing licenses, representing things on behalf of the university, that all funnels through offices like this, and I think that just makes them the natural construct to work on these types of issues with respect to open source. And then lastly, I'll say is like anyone like me who works in computational research, like all my work is basically AI these days. Like open source is just a way of life, both on the inputs and on the outputs. So, faculty are all relying on whatever open models they can find to do basic research in these areas and build their new model or tune their model to do some new thing that's useful. And then they also have to validate their own work, so it needs to be shared with licenses so other researchers can understand it. It can be peer reviewed, it can be part of a normal academic process. So open source is like here whether people like me want it there or not. It's just something that needs to be dealt with, and if you're going to think about translating computational research. So the first thing we did, and I think I'm probably running out of time here, but the first thing we did was we were trying to think about what this group means by what do we care about? Where do we think we can make a difference on open source? This is our working definition of what open source impact is. So the group is called Open Source as Tech Transfer. And we just went through and thought about the different activities we do that would demonstrate impact of open source research. And so this is just, I won't read it, but it captures, I think, a broad statement of what we care about and what we think we do as offices. And so I thought it was a good place to start when we were trying to think about how we formalize this as part of our roles. So once you knew what type of impact you wanted to make, then you could start coming up with what we could actually do. So as I showed you earlier, there's that kind of flow of how tech transfer offices work. These are some of the actual activities that go into that flow. So we can initially meet with faculty who have projects and help them build distributable projects. A lot of faculty are not open source developers. They do not, and their students don't understand how open source licensing works. They need a lot of help in structuring repositories in a way that's like sustainably built and legal to distribute from the university. There's also, you need to know the objective. So, sometimes they come to you just wanting to make, as widely disseminated research tool as possible. And, that takes on one strategy. Other times they come to you wanting to start a company, and they're very conscious about that, and that may imply another strategy. And so getting out in front and working with them on these project release stages, is an initial touch point where we can make an impact. I won't go through all of these, but the basic result of all this is we've identified analogous activities to what we do in like a normal proprietary tech transfer function. We've tried to find analogous activities to that would advance an open source project, and tie that to how we would actually behave, if this was a dedicated part of what we did. At the end, the goal is really for all of tech transfer is sustainability. The offices behave as though they're businesses, and so they may not say that forthright, but really you can't transfer technology without having a sustainability model for it. It's not successful, it doesn't benefit anyone if there's no one to pay for it or resource it. So at the end, what we want is sustainable open source projects, just like we want sustainable proprietary technology. That can take probably three main models. I don't know if you all are familiar with the term cost or commercial source, but it is a sort of a common way of describing startups that have some significant open source project as part of their work. But then are also finding a way to commercialize that in some form or another. That's one major model that I think we tried to push if possible. There's also open source foundations as an endpoint for tech transfer. That is not as common. It can be hard to do, but it is, I think, for a lot of research software, the natural end. So that's a situation where you may have industry sponsors or other sorts of private sector people who see benefit to this type of infrastructure, funding it on a voluntary basis and sitting in some sort of fiscal sponsor like Linux or any other large open source foundation. And then internal support just means finding collaborations with other universities or other ways of using the university to structure support for open source on campus. So once you do that, what the metrics that fall out are pretty obvious. I mean, you can just start counting some of these activities in the same way that you count the other activities I showed you before. And this is, fairly straightforward, but if this were something that were standardized, it would go a long way to helping us justify spending times on these things. It would create visibility over these types of activities. Folks would get credit for doing so, and it would become part of a normal part of their jobs. So what it's kind of hides the ball on what I think is really most important, which is these are other metrics we're thinking and working on. Adoption outside of the university, I think, is what we really want to know. And that, unfortunately, is very hard to do for open source projects because open source by design is meant to be freeing to people using it. They don't have to report to you. It's very hard to, to detect when people are using things. But finding some way to get a handle on that would be nice. The Chaos group has some interesting tools to evaluate the health and vibrancy of a project, which I think is a pretty good proxy for how much it's being adopted. So that's something we're looking at. As I mentioned, Stephanie and her group at UC Santa Cruz have a tool for helping to just count all the open source that happens on a university. That's also something that's a lot harder to do than you would realize. Universities don't have a lot of control over how their research is managed. So it can be difficult identifying which projects are really being driven by university people or not. So these are some of the things we're working on and trying to come up with additional ways of counting. And just to tie it back to sort of the bigger picture here, as I was saying earlier, our offices are really the mechanism for translating federal funding into real impact in the world. One of the main ways we can do that is making research software more sustainable and reusable. That's a major thing that's happening on campus that basically, you build a really useful research tool, whether it's drug discovery or some other modeling or something that's grant funded. Those grants eventually go away. They're 5-year cycles. Maybe you'll get 2 of them. It'll be a 10-year project. But I spend a lot of my time trying to help researchers figure out ways to keep this basic research tool available and shared. Also, in a day where we actually fund digital infrastructure, I think universities could be a major supplier of that infrastructure. So, thinking about university research directly translating to these sort of fundamental things that would be government funded or government promoted, I think would be a real benefit of increased open source activity from tech transfer offices. And then finally, starting more businesses. So that's the thing that aligns most with what sort of normal tech transfer offices think. And I think taking open source seriously could really help accelerate that. So thank you.